At a bustling airport, Jungkook made a move no one expected, especially not Taehyung. What he did left everyone speechless and Taehyung visibly shaken. "Stop him! Jungkook, don't!" A voice rang out, sharp and panicked, cutting through the thick buzz of Seoul's international terminal. The crowd parted like water splitting around a rock, eyes darting from one another, unsure of what was unfolding, but certain that something electric had just cracked open the air. Taehyung was frozen in place, mouth slightly ajar, staring across the terminal as Jungkook dropped his bag to the marble floor and stormed toward the security gate, not to board, but to block someone else's way. The security guards reached for their radios, hands hovering over their hips. Cameras flashed from army fans who had just come for a glimpse of their idols, not expecting a scene straight out of a drama. But this wasn't scripted. This wasn't performative. Jungkook's jaw was clenched, like he was holding back a scream, but his eyes betrayed him wide, glassy, desperate. Taehyung couldn't move. The back of his neck tingled, the kind of chill you feel when you're seconds too late to stop a disaster. It had all started earlier that morning, hours before the airport incident, in the tight silence of their shared dressing room. The air was heavy with what hadn't been said. Jungkook had barely looked up from his phone, and Taehyung's hands had trembled as he tied the laces of his boots, pretending not to notice the tension suffocating them both. "Are you really going?" Taehyung had asked quietly. Jungkook didn't answer. Now, here they were, Jungkook pushing through layers of fans and staff, ignoring the chaos, eyes locked on a slender figure in a hoodie walking briskly toward the departure gate. That figure was Jimin, and he wasn't stopping. Not even when Jungkook shouted his name. "Jimin!" Jungkook yelled, voice raw, the kind of sound that cracked you open. "Please, wait!" The entire terminal hushed. Even the constant background murmur of flights and calls for boarding seemed to dim. Taehyung inhaled sharply, every breath brittle. He hadn't known Jungkook was going to do this. None of them did. After days of silence, cryptic social media posts, and a building storm of rumors about fractured friendships and missed rehearsals, the truth was bleeding into the public eye in the worst way right here, in front of strangers, staff, and flashing phones. Jimin paused. He didn't turn, but he paused. That pause was enough for Jungkook to reach him. The younger man's hands gripped Jimin's wrist. Not roughly, but like he was afraid Jimin would vanish if he let go. "Don't leave like this," Jungkook breathed, just loud enough that the microphones couldn't pick it up. But Taehyung could hear it from where he stood. "Not when you haven't even told me why." Jimin's shoulders rose and fell, stiff and controlled. "It's not your decision anymore," he replied, voice calm but quivering at the edges. "You made yours when you walked away that night." Jungkook's face twisted. "I walked away because I didn't want to hurt you. You hurt me anyway." Taehyung felt like a ghost in his own body, as if he was watching something intimate unravel that had been building behind the scenes for months, years, even. None of them had talked about what happened in Tokyo. Not after that night on the rooftop. Not after the missed flight. Not after the interview where Jungkook stared off into space while Jimin smiled through barely held back tears. But now it was all here. Public. Raw. Exploding into the open under white airport lights. Taehyung took a step forward. "Jungkook," he called out carefully, like you'd speak to someone standing on a ledge. "Maybe this isn't the place." Jungkook didn't even glance at him. "It has to be here." He was going to leave. Jimin slowly turned then, his eyes meeting Jungkook's, red-rimmed, but cold. "You didn't fight for me before. Why now?" "I didn't know how," Jungkook whispered. The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched between the three of them like a scar. Fans recorded, unaware of the truth beneath the surface. Staff murmured to each other nervously. But inside that triangle, Jungkook, Jimin, and Taehyung time warped. Then, without warning, Jungkook did something that made Taehyung's blood drain from his face. Jungkook dropped to his knees. Not for a performance, not for fan service, not for drama. He dropped to his knees in front of Jimin, in a desperate, human act of vulnerability that shattered the carefully built facade of global stardom. He wasn't Jungkook of BTS in that moment. He was just a boy begging someone not to walk away. "I don't want to lose you," he choked out. Not again. Taehyung couldn't breathe. His hand gripped the strap of his bag so tightly it burned into his skin. Jimin stared at Jungkook, frozen, torn between anger and heartbreak. His lips parted, then closed, then parted again. But he said nothing. Not yet. That moment would go viral in minutes. Fans would dissect the angles, the expressions, the tension, but they wouldn't know what had led to it. They wouldn't know the nights Jungkook spent on the floor of their dorm room, headphones in, pretending he couldn't hear Jimin crying on the other side of the wall. They wouldn't know about Taehyung's silence, the burden of watching two people you love tear each other apart while pretending everything was fine. The story was never just about what happened at the airport. It was about what had been building in the shadows long before the flight announcements began. Jungkook remained on his knees. Jimin stood still. Taehyung's heart pounded. And the world, for one impossible moment, held its breath. Jimin didn't speak for what felt like eternity. The silence roared in Jungkook's ears louder than the engines of the planes taxiing outside the terminal glass. On his knees, Jungkook felt every second stretch like a punishment, as if time itself had decided to make him feel the weight of every mistake he had ever made. He could hear murmurs spreading among the gathering crowd, whispers of confusion, shock, disbelief, but all of it faded behind the one person standing in front of him. Jimin's expression was unreadable. His arms stayed limp by his sides, but his fingers curled slightly, an involuntary motion, a crack in the wall he'd spent months building. His gaze wasn't angry, nor was it cold anymore. It was just tired, as if he'd spent so long holding back that now, even fury seemed too exhausting. "Get up!" Jimin finally said, not unkindly, but firmly. Jungkook's head lifted slightly, the glimmer of hope that danced in his eyes almost too fragile to hold. "Please," he whispered again, voice hoarse. "Don't get on that plane." Jimin didn't move. "I told them to hold my boarding for 15 minutes, he said quietly. "Because some part of me thought, maybe. But then I told myself not to hope." "You can," Jungkook said, standing now slowly, cautiously, as if any sudden motion might break what was left between them. "You can hope again. I'm here, Jimin." Jimin laughed, but it was empty. "You weren't here when it mattered. You were everywhere else, smiling on camera, flying to interviews, recording late night. You made me feel like I was just a pause in your schedule." "That's not true," Jungkook snapped, pain flaring in his voice. "You were the only constant. You were the only thing I thought about every time I stepped on stage. But I didn't know how to show it without ruining everything." "You think this?" Jimin gestured around at the crowd, at the cameras, at the staff frozen like statues. "You think this isn't ruining everything?" "I don't care anymore," Jungkook said, and for the first time he wasn't apologizing. He wasn't hesitant. "Let them watch. Let the world burn. You're the only thing that matters." Taehyung had moved closer, quietly inserting himself between the edge of the chaos and the core of it. His presence wasn't loud, but grounding. He watched both of them, his eyes a storm of emotions, guilt swirling behind his lashes. He had seen the tension grow, had felt it in every rehearsal, every postponed dinner, every glance that never quite met the other. He blamed himself, in part for choosing silence when he should have spoken, for letting the cracks deepen until they became chasms. "Jungkook," Taehyung said softly, and it was enough to make the younger man look at him. "You need to mean this beyond the airport. You need to mean it tomorrow, next month, when the world isn't watching." "I will," Jungkook said without hesitation. "If he lets me." Jimin closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was a wetness in them that hadn't been there before, his breath shaking. "What do you want me to do, Jungkook?" he asked. "Just forget everything? Pretend none of it happened?" "No," Jungkook replied. "But I want a chance to make new memories that drown out the ones that hurt." A silence fell again, thick and charged, but this time, it was different. There was a thread connecting them, stretched but not snapped. Jimin looked at his boarding pass, then back at Jungkook. "He tore it in half," gasps echoed. But Jimin didn't care. "You get one shot," he said. "Not 10, not 5. 1. Don't waste it." Jungkook stepped forward instinctively, but stopped when Jimin raised a hand. "Not here," Jimin said, not unkindly, not in front of them. And just like that, Jimin turned around and walked toward the nearest private exit. Jungkook followed, not too close, just enough to let him lead. Taehyung stood in place, watching them disappear behind the frosted glass. Behind him, Staff began to breathe again, and the crowd started buzzing louder, hashtags already being formed, videos going viral, headlines being written. But Taehyung wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the look on Jungkook's face, the desperation, the heartbreak, the regret. And he was thinking about Jimin's silence before he turned away. It was far from over. Outside, the wind howled. It carried the weight of things unsaid, the gravity of decisions not yet made. In the car, Jimin sat in silence. Jungkook sat beside him. The space between them, charged with electricity. Neither spoke for a long time. Then Jungkook quietly reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper, worn, slightly crumpled. Jimin hesitated, then took it. It was a letter, written in Jungkook's handwriting. The date on it was from weeks ago. "I didn't send it," Jungkook said. "I thought it was too late, but maybe you should know what I was trying to say." Jimin unfolded it slowly. The words inside were raw, messy, real. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't poetic. It was just Jungkook confessing the sleepless nights, the jealousy, the fear of losing Jimin not just as a person, but as the one thing that made him feel anchored. Jimin read every word. He folded it again, and then he looked at Jungkook. "This doesn't fix everything," he said. "I know, but it's a start." Jungkook nodded. As the car pulled away from the airport, neither of them noticed the photographer still hiding behind the terminal pillars, snapping the last blurry photo of their retreating silhouettes. Nor did they see Taehyung lingering in the parking lot, his phone still in his hand, his thumb hovering over a message he had typed but never sent. It said, asterisk. Please don't break him again. Asterisk. But Taehyung deleted it. For now, he would let them try. The skies above Seoul opened, not with rain, but with light, a sun breaking through clouds that had hung over them for far too long. There would be turbulence ahead, but for the first time in months, there was also direction, and that was enough. The car ride stretched in silence, but it was no longer suffocating. It was contemplative, full of words unspoken not because they were too painful, but because they were finally being given space to breathe. The city lights flickered through the tinted windows, casting fragmented reflections on Jimin's face as he leaned his head against the glass. Jungkook sat beside him, his hands clasped tightly on his lap, resisting every urge to reach out, to touch, to hold, to ask for forgiveness with gestures instead of words. But he stayed still. He understood that this wasn't a moment to be stolen. It had to be earned. Jimin's mind was a flood of memories. Laughter echoing through practice rooms. Whispered secrets exchanged during long-haul flights. The quiet intimacy of late-night ramen shared in dim dorm kitchens. But alongside those lived the arguments, the cold shoulders, the missed birthdays, the feeling of invisibility despite being in the same room. He wasn't sure if what he felt now was love's ghost or its revival, but the letter had shaken something loose in him. It hadn't been dramatic or poetic. It had been clumsy and honest, full of crossed-out sentences, smudged ink, and too many apologies that never found the courage to be delivered. That, perhaps, made it real. Jungkook finally spoke, his voice soft, unsure. "I didn't expect you to rip that ticket. I didn't expect you to kneel," Jimin replied without looking at him. "So I guess we're even." Jungkook gave a quiet chuckle, more breath than sound. "I was terrified you'd walk away. I almost did." "Why didn't you?" Jimin turned then, not sharply, but with the kind of weight that comes from deciding to face something fully. "Because you looked like you were finally ready to lose everything if it meant being honest, and I couldn't ignore that." They arrived at Jungkook's apartment, a place Jimin hadn't been in months. It was eerily familiar. The scent of the old reed diffuser still lingered faintly in the hallway, and Jimin noticed the same Polaroids pinned near the door. Photos from a trip to Busan, late-night studio sessions, Taehyung asleep with a marker mustache on his face. Jungkook stepped aside, letting Jimin walk in first. He didn't offer tea or water. He didn't say welcome. They weren't guests here. This was something else. Jimin sat on the couch slowly, his fingers brushing over the soft fabric. Jungkook remained standing for a moment, then sat across from him, the coffee table like a line between them, full of things they hadn't yet said. "I want to try again," Jungkook said, his voice lower now. "Not because I miss what we had, but because I think we can have something better, stronger, honest." Jimin didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the corner of the room, where a small box sat filled with old fan gifts, letters, and keepsakes. He remembered packing that box with Jungkook once, both of them laughing at the weird trinkets and crying over the ones that meant something deep. Trying again means we talk, Jimin said. Really talk. Even when it's ugly. Even when we don't want to. I know. It means not shutting down when things get hard. Not running. I promise. You've promised before. And I broke it. Jungkook's voice cracked slightly. But I don't want to be that version of me anymore. A beat passed. Jimin looked down at his hands. I never stopped loving you, he said quietly. Even when I hated you. The admission made Jungkook exhale like he'd been underwater. He moved around the table and sat beside Jimin. Not too close, but close enough that their shoulders brushed slightly. I was so scared, Jungkook confessed, of being seen for everything I was. Not just the perfect version, but the messy, confused, jealous, insecure one. I wanted to see all of you, Jimin replied. That was the point. I know that now. Their heads turned slowly, and for the first time in so long, their eyes met without armor. Jungkook's were rimmed red, not from tears now, but from a soul unburdening. Jimin's were soft, cautious, but no longer guarded. Jungkook lifted his hand, slowly, and rested it on Jimin's. No grip, no pull, just presence. An offering. Jimin didn't move away. They sat like that for minutes. That didn't feel like minutes until the world outside dimmed, and only the low hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic remained. When Jimin finally leaned his head onto Jungkook's shoulder, there was no grand declaration, just breath sinking, chests rising in tandem, and silence that felt sacred. The next few days passed quietly. No posts, no statements. Hybe had gone into silent PR mode, unsure how to navigate what the fans had seen at the airport. Speculation soared, fan theories multiplying by the hour. Some were furious, others moved. But the three at the center of it, Jungkook, Jimin, and Taehyung, remained untouched by it for once. They had more important battles to fight. Taehyung was the first to reach out. He sent a message. Asterisk, asterisk. Come to the studio, just us. Asterisk, asterisk. Jungkook read it twice before replying. Asterisk, asterisk. We'll be there. Asterisk, asterisk. When the door opened and Taehyung saw them walk in side by side, he didn't speak. He simply opened his arms. They all stood in the center of that room. The same one where they had spent a decade chasing dreams, perfecting harmonies, learning each other's rhythms. And now, they had to relearn them. Not as idols, as people. The studio session didn't result in a song. Not that night. It resulted in laughter, in awkward truths, in apologies, in silence, filled with understanding. Taehyung strummed a few chords on the acoustic guitar, absent-mindedly. Jimin hummed under his breath. Jungkook tapped a beat on his thigh. It wasn't music yet, but it would be. They didn't rush it. Instead, they chose presence. They ate together after. Real food. Messy, imperfect. No cameras, no fans. Just three boys older now. Softer, scarred, and still here. Jungkook walked Jimin home that night. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. They didn't hold hands, but when they reached the door, Jimin turned and looked at him for a long time. Do you remember what you told me the first time you walked me home? Jungkook smiled faintly. That I'd walk you home every night until you told me to stop. Jimin nodded. You stopped. I was waiting for you to tell me to start again. You can start again now. And Jungkook did. Step by step. No rush. Just presence. And love rebuilding itself in the quiet spaces they used to ignore. The world would have their theories. But this time, it didn't matter. They knew their truth. And it was enough. The morning light slipped through the sheer curtains of Jimin's apartment. Warm and golden, casting soft lines over the wooden floor. It painted everything in the gentle glow of new beginnings. Jungkook stood in the doorway, quiet, watching Jimin from across the room. Jimin hadn't noticed him yet. He was at the kitchen counter, stirring his coffee with a calmness that felt almost sacred. The hum of the city outside was muffled, a distant backdrop to something far more intimate happening inside these four walls. Jungkook walked forward slowly, each step careful. like he was afraid of breaking the silence too soon. When Jimin finally turned, their eyes met with something unspoken that had grown between them, something fragile and rare. It wasn't the intensity of their early days, the fire that consumed everything. No, this was different. It was steadier now, like embers that refused to die out, like warmth rediscovered. "You're awake early," Jimin said softly, his voice like silk brushing across skin. "I couldn't sleep," Jungkook replied, leaning against the frame of the kitchen. "Too many thoughts. About last night? About everything." Jimin looked down at his coffee, then gestured toward the second cup beside it. "I made you one." Jungkook smiled, stepping closer. He reached for the mug, their fingers brushing for a second, too brief, too charged. It was a reminder that touch still carried weight between them, still sparked something even now, especially now. Jungkook took a sip, the bitter warmth grounding him. For a while, they just stood there, side by side, looking out the window together. Seoul stretched far beyond the glass. But in that moment, the city felt small. It felt like the only thing that mattered was this room, this silence, this shared breath. "Do you think we can really do this?" Jimin asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jungkook didn't hesitate. "I think we already are." The day passed in soft moments, wordless connections. They didn't need grand gestures. Jimin cleaned his studio while Jungkook lay on the couch, head tilted back, eyes closed but not asleep. At one point, Jimin played a song, an old one they had never released. Something acoustic, raw. Jungkook hummed along without realizing it, and Jimin turned to look at him with an expression that was somewhere between heartbreak and hope. By the time night came, they found themselves walking through the quiet streets, their hoods pulled up, masks on not because they had to, but because it allowed them a strange kind of anonymity. The city was different at night, softer, honest. They wandered without a destination, letting their steps fall in sync, their conversations dipping between deep and mundane. "Do you remember that one night after rehearsal?" Jungkook asked suddenly. "The one where we walked for hours and ended up by the river." "You were mad," Jimin said with a half smile. "You kept saying you didn't need anyone. And you stayed anyway." "I always stayed." Jungkook stopped walking. The streetlight overhead buzzed gently. "Why?" Jimin looked at him. Really looked at him. "Because even when you were trying to push me away, I could still see the part of you that wanted to be held." Jungkook swallowed hard. "I didn't deserve it." "Maybe not then. But you're different now." They sat on a bench near the edge of the Han River, the cold seeping into the stone beneath them. Jungkook's fingers twitched in his lap, and then, slowly, he reached out. Jimin didn't pull away. Their hands found each other like they always had in the dark, without asking, without needing permission. The wind brushed through their hair. A boat moved across the river, its lights casting ripples that shimmered like stars trapped in water. "I'm scared," Jungkook admitted. "Scared I'll mess this up again." "We will mess up," Jimin replied. "That's what people do. But the point isn't being perfect. It's being willing to stay, to keep trying." Jungkook turned to him, eyes reflecting the city lights. "So you'll stay?" Jimin nodded. "As long as you do." They stayed out until the cold became too much, then returned to Jimin's apartment. He handed Jungkook a sweatshirt from the closet, one of his own, old and soft from too many washes. Jungkook smiled when he pulled it over his head, the scent of Jimin wrapping around him like a second skin.
They lay down together, not touching at first, just lying there, listening to the hum of life beyond the window. But eventually, Jungkook shifted, his hand finding Jimin's beneath the blanket. Jimin turned his head, eyes half-lidded with sleep, and whispered, "You don't have to be strong tonight." "I know," Jungkook replied. "I just want to be honest." And he was. In the stillness of that room, he told Jimin everything he hadn't before. About the pressure, the fear of being a disappointment, the nights he stared at the ceiling wishing he could turn back time. He told him about how fame had warped things, made him forget how to be soft, how to say what he felt without fear of it being used against him. He told him about the letters he never sent, the songs he wrote but deleted, the dreams he had where Jimin was always walking away. Jimin listened, never interrupting. He just listened, and when Jungkook's voice broke, he reached out and touched his cheek, letting his thumb trace the edge of a tear. "You're not a burden," Jimin said. "You never were." Jungkook closed his eyes, leaned into the touch. Then stay. I already did. Sleep found them tangled in quiet understanding, not promises but presence. When the morning came, they woke up in the same rhythm, moving slowly, carefully. Breakfast was quiet. A shared look over toast and eggs said more than any conversation. Outside, the world was waking up to new headlines, new speculation. But neither of them checked their phones. Not yet. They weren't ready to let the outside world in. Not until they were sure their world inside was strong enough to withstand it. The knock on the door came in the afternoon. It was Taehyung. He didn't say anything when Jimin opened the door. He just looked between the two of them, nodded once, then walked in. They sat together in the living room, the three of them. For a moment it felt like years ago, the early days, the laughter, the dreams that felt too big. And then slowly, like a puzzle falling into place, they began to talk. Not about music or schedules or charts, but about each other, about what had broken, what needed to be rebuilt. Taehyung apologized for the distance he had put between them when everything started to fall apart. Jungkook apologized for not reaching out sooner. Jimin admitted he had shut both of them out, not just Jungkook. They cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just tears that came when wounds were finally seen. The healing didn't happen in one day. But it started. With every shared meal, every inside joke remembered, every walk around the block, every late-night chat on the balcony with the stars overhead. They were not who they used to be. But maybe that was the point. They weren't trying to go back. They were trying to move forward. Together. And for the first time in a long time, it felt possible. The apartment had become a sanctuary of unspoken truce, where time moved slowly, deliberately. It was 3 in the morning when Jungkook awoke again, not from a nightmare, but from the ache of needing to be certain. Moonlight spilled across the hardwood floor in silver sheets, and Jimin lay next to him, his breathing steady, face softened in sleep. Jungkook studied the lines of his face like reading a language he once forgot how to understand. He didn't dare move. He only watched, letting his heart settle into the quiet rhythm of this piece. Outside, the wind whispered against the glass, gentle but persistent, like it was trying to remind the world of its presence. In that silence, Jungkook realized something strange. He wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. He wasn't expecting to wake up to cold distance or the echo of a slammed door. There was still so much to fix, yes, but for once he believed it could be done without pretending, without performing. When morning came, it arrived with rain, a soft drizzle tapping against the windows. Jimin stirred beside him, blinking slowly, hair tousled and eyes heavy with sleep. He didn't speak right away, but he didn't pull away either. He rolled onto his side and looked at Jungkook with an expression unreadable to anyone else. But to Jungkook, it meant everything. It was recognition, memory, a quiet kind of trust. "You were watching me sleep," Jimin murmured, voice gravelly with sleep and something tender beneath it. Jungkook smiled faintly, "Just making sure you were real." Jimin let out a breath of amusement, "Still here." They got up late. Breakfast was made together, not because it was tradition but because it felt natural. Jungkook cooking eggs, Jimin cutting fruit, the occasional bump of elbows and brushes of hands turning ordinary moments into gravity-defying ones. They didn't need to speak much. The silence between them had changed. It no longer held weight but warmth. The world outside, however, was far from silent. The airport incident had exploded into every corner of the internet. Videos, slowed-down clips, enhanced audios. Every expression, every whisper, every movement dissected and analyzed by fans and media alike. Headlines ranged from poetic to invasive, and speculations ran wild. Some called it a confession. Others called it a meltdown. The truth, of course, was known only by 3 people, and none of them had spoken to the press. HYBE was panicking quietly. Emails flooded in, meeting requests, damage control teams activated, but the members didn't respond, not yet. They weren't ready to hand this story over to the world when it was still unfolding inside them. They weren't ready to let headlines twist something that was, at its core, deeply human. It was Taehyung who suggested they meet again. This time not in a studio but in the rooftop garden of the old dorm building, long since empty but still accessible, a place of memories, of beginnings, and maybe now of reconciliation. Jimin hesitated when they arrived, staring up at the familiar staircase. Jungkook stood beside him, hands buried in his pockets as if anchoring himself. "You okay?" he asked. "I haven't been up there in years," Jimin replied, almost in a whisper. "Me neither." They climbed together, the creak of each step carrying ghosts of late-night snacks, laughter echoing through halls, fights that felt earth-shattering at the time. At the top, the door opened with a rusty groan, and the sky greeted them with a gray hue, clouds low and heavy but not threatening. Taehyung was already there, leaning against the railing, his hair tousled by the wind, a thermos in his hand. He turned slowly when he heard them, and for a moment none of them moved, just three silhouettes standing still in the place where they first became a family. "I brought coffee," Taehyung said simply. Jimin walked forward first, then Jungkook. They took their seats on the weathered wooden benches that still sat beneath the overhang, damp but familiar. The quiet wasn't awkward, it was reverent, as if all of them were paying respects to the version of themselves they used to be. "Everything's spiraling online," Taehyung said finally. "HYBE's about to send in a PR army." "I figured," Jungkook murmured. "They want us to either deny or clarify." "And what do we want?" Jimin asked. Taehyung looked at him. "I think we want to be able to breathe, without pretending." The rain began to fall again, not hard but steady, a gentle pattering against the tin roof above them. Jungkook leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I'm done pretending," he said. "In the airport I thought I was ruining everything. But maybe that was the first honest thing I've done in a long time." "No maybe about it," Jimin said. Taehyung gave a slow nod. "It shocked me," he admitted. "Not because you did it, but because you finally stopped caring about being perfect." "I'm tired of being perfect," Jungkook whispered. "It's killing parts of me I didn't even know I'd buried." A gust of wind swept over them, cold and clean. Jimin looked up at the sky, rain tapping against his face, and closed his eyes for a moment. Maybe this is what freedom feels like. Messy, scary, but real. They stayed there for hours, soaked but unmoved, talking through things they hadn't dared bring up before. Regrets, mistakes, longings, betrayals that weren't loud but were felt deeply. And somewhere in the middle of it, a quiet forgiveness began to take root, not spoken outright but understood. A mutual acknowledgement that they had hurt each other and also loved each other enough to try again. When they finally stood, the rain had eased, leaving the air crisp and the city below washed clean. They walked back down the stairs as equals, no one leading, no one following. They weren't fixed, not entirely, but they were no longer broken in silence. Over the following days, a statement was drafted, not by HYBE's legal team but by them. It wasn't polished. It wasn't a PR spin. It was a letter to ARMY, to everyone. They released it together, Jimin, Jungkook. Taehyung on their own terms. They didn't explain everything. They didn't owe the world everything. But they gave enough to remind people that they were human. That behind the flawless performances, the synchronized steps, and perfect smiles were real people trying to find each other again. The backlash was expected, so was the outpouring of love. But they didn't read the comments anymore. Instead, they created. In the studio, laughter began to replace silence. The music that emerged was different, less about perfection, more about truth. Jungkook wrote melodies that were raw and stripped down. Jimin's lyrics cut deeper but healed too. Taehyung's voice wove through both like thread, pulling it all together. They weren't chasing the charts anymore. They were chasing connection. And somewhere in that pursuit, they found each other again, not as the boys they were, but as the men they had become. It didn't matter what the next stage looked like. Because finally, after all the noise, they were choosing each other. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. A week passed. Not in the way time usually slips by unnoticed, but in a way that demanded attention, every day heavier with meaning than the last. Seoul's winter seemed gentler now, though the cold hadn't left. It was as if the city itself was exhaling slowly, letting the weight of 1,000 assumptions melt into something quieter. Jimin stood by the window of Jungkook's apartment, his breath ghosting across the glass as he watched people move below, their umbrellas blooming like flowers under the pale sky. Behind him, the room was silent, the hum of the heater the only sound between them. Jungkook sat cross-legged on the floor, sketchbook open, pencil between his fingers. He wasn't drawing anything in particular, just letting his hand move, like muscle memory was more trustworthy than thought. Jimin hadn't said much that morning. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't cold anymore. It was contemplative, like a lake just before dawn. They had learned how to exist together again, not by trying to reclaim what was lost, but by letting each day rewrite the story between them in slow, deliberate ink. Taehyung came over just before sunset, carrying a paper bag with pastries and a bottle of soju tucked under his arm like an afterthought. He didn't knock. He didn't have to. He entered like he belonged there, which, in some ways, he always had. The three of them sat on the floor, legs folded, backs leaning against the furniture, pastries disappearing one by one as the bottle slowly emptied, their laughter loosening with every sip. It was Taehyung who brought up the concert first, the one they had promised to do together months ago before everything cracked open. "They still want us to headline," he said, tipping his glass, "even after all the drama." Jimin raised an eyebrow. "Of course they do. Publicity is publicity." "But we can't do it half-heartedly," Jungkook added. "Not this time." "We never did before," Jimin said, "but we weren't always honest either." Taehyung nodded, the tips of his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wooden floor. "So let's do it differently. Strip everything back, just us. No tricks, no spectacle, just the music and the truth." It sounded terrifying and perfect. They started meeting in the studio every day after that, not because they were being watched or because schedules demanded it, but because they wanted to, needed to. The old routines came back slowly, like memories resurfacing in fragments. Jungkook would arrive first, coffee already cold by the time the others came in. Jimin would hum ideas while curled on the couch, hair still wet from the shower. Taehyung would wander in late, as always, guitar case slung over his shoulder like a badge of stubborn charm. They didn't talk about the airport anymore, not directly, but it hovered there sometimes, in glances, in pauses, in the softness of Jungkook's voice when he suggested a lyric, in the way Jimin's hand would rest lightly on Jungkook's back without thinking. That moment had been a rupture, a reckoning, and it had also been the start of something truer than any of them had dared hope. The song they wrote first was about silence, about all the things they didn't say when they should have. The track had no heavy beat, no layered synths, just strings, and their voices raw and close, like secrets spoken in the dark. It was Jimin who came up with the chorus, 4 lines that sounded like confession and forgiveness intertwined. When they recorded it, the room felt too small for the emotion in the air. Jimin's voice cracked on the second take. Taehyung's harmonies came in late, like he was holding back. Jungkook took off his headphones halfway through the bridge and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, swallowing something thick in his throat. No one said anything. They didn't have to. The silence after the final note was enough to know they had touched something real. Later, as they walked home under the dim streetlights, their breath fogging in the air, Jimin reached out and took Jungkook's hand. It wasn't planned. It wasn't performative. It was quiet and instinctive, like muscle memory. Jungkook held on tightly, and they kept walking. As the concert drew closer, pressure mounted, but for once, it didn't fracture them. The rumors didn't sting the way they used to, not when they had reclaimed the narrative, not when they had stood on the rooftop of the past and looked each other in the eye with nothing left to hide. They announced the concert themselves with a handwritten note posted to social media, Just a photo of their hands on the studio console and a caption that simply read, "We're coming home." Fans went wild. There were debates, hashtags, think pieces, but beneath it all there was a hum of something deeper, hope. The night of the concert, the stadium was sold out, lights painting the sky with anticipation. Backstage, the three of them stood in a quiet triangle, earpieces in, breathing in sync. Jungkook looked at them, at Jimin, eyes glowing even in the dim light, and at Taehyung, who nodded without words. They stepped onto the stage, not as idols performing perfection, but as three people who had broken, bled, healed, and chosen each other again. The opening notes played, and Jungkook began to sing. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Jimin. And when Jimin joined him, their harmony wasn't just music, it was memory, regret, love, 1,000 unsaid things finally finding a voice. The final song of the night wasn't choreographed. They stood at the edge of the stage, arms around each other's shoulders, hair tousled with sweat, eyes glossy under the lights. Jungkook spoke into the mic, voice quiet but steady. "We're not perfect. We've made mistakes, but we're still here and we're still choosing to be here." The crowd screamed, but even above the noise, Jimin's voice came through, soft but sure, as he added, "Thank you for waiting for us, even when we didn't know how to wait for ourselves." They bowed together, not as an ending, but as a beginning. And as the lights dimmed, the three of them stood there, unmoving, staring out into a sea of stars held in hands, phones lit, tears falling, hearts beating in rhythm. They were no longer afraid. Because love, even when fractured, even when battered by silence and shadow, had found its way back through the noise. And this time they wouldn't let go. The cheers were still vibrating through the floor when they walked offstage, breathless and stunned. It wasn't the noise that left them shaken. It was the weight of what they had just shared. The crowd had given them their voices, their hearts, their faith, but for once, Jungkook felt like he hadn't needed to become someone else to be worthy of it. His body ached from the set, shirt damp with sweat, hands trembling not from exertion, but from release. Jimin was just ahead of him, pulling out his earpiece with shaking fingers, his mouth parted as if trying to inhale something bigger than air. Taehyung followed silently behind, uncharacteristically quiet, his jaw set with emotion he hadn't let show on stage. No one said anything as the dressing room door shut behind them. They all stood there, staring at nothing, surrounded by bouquets they didn't yet have the energy to acknowledge. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of unshed tears, full of what the stage had taken from them and given back tenfold. Jimin was the first to move. He walked to the mirror, placed both hands on the counter, and stared at his reflection. His face looked older somehow, not tired, but aged by the truth of what they'd just done. Slowly, Jungkook stepped behind him. Their eyes met in the mirror, and Jimin didn't look away. "You were shaking," Jimin said softly. "So were you," Jungkook replied. Jimin turned, and Jungkook caught his wrist before he could move away. His touch was light but grounding. Jimin didn't flinch. He didn't retreat like he used to. Instead, he stepped closer. The lights around the mirror buzzed faintly, casting their shadows on the wall like quiet echoes of their past selves. "I couldn't sing that last chorus without thinking about that night," Jungkook admitted. "The one where you didn't say goodbye." "I know," Jimin said. "I remembered it too." "Do you think we're different now?" Jimin let his eyes close for a moment, as if weighing the question. Then he opened them, and there was something so open in his gaze it made Jungkook's chest ache. "I don't know if we're different," he said, "but we're braver, and that counts for something." Taehyung, still leaning against the wall with a towel around his neck, watched them with quiet intensity. He didn't interrupt. He just observed, like someone watching two stars begin to orbit again after nearly colliding. "Taehyung," Jungkook said suddenly, turning toward him. "Back then, during that night in Tokyo, you knew, didn't you?" Taehyung didn't pretend not to understand. He met Jungkook's gaze directly. "I knew," he said. I saw it before either of you did." Jimin looked down at his hands. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because it wasn't mine to fix," Taehyung answered, his voice low. "And because I was scared if I pushed too hard it would all shatter." "And it did anyway," Jungkook whispered. "But now you're holding the pieces," Taehyung replied. "Together, that's the difference." The door opened then, staff members rushing in, congratulating, praising, trying to pull them into schedules and post-show obligations. But none of them moved. Not yet. Not until Jimin reached out and laced his fingers with Jungkook's. Not until Taehyung, without a word, moved to the center of the room and opened his arms wide, a silent invitation. Jimin and Jungkook didn't hesitate. They walked into it, into him, into each other. They stood there, the three of them, heads touching, arms wrapped tight. That moment wasn't broadcasted. No cameras captured it, but it became the heartbeat of everything that followed. The next few weeks unfolded with surreal grace. Headlines changed their tune. What once was framed as scandal now softened into redemption. The media couldn't quite decide whether to celebrate or question, but the fans already had their answer. They showed up in numbers, in messages, in quiet acts of love, holding banners that read, "Thank you for choosing each other, and we see you. We always did." It didn't fix everything. There were still sleepless nights. There were still awkward pauses during interviews where words caught in throats. There were still mornings when Jungkook would wake up in Jimin's apartment and wonder if all of it was just a fragile dream waiting to fracture again. But Jimin would always find him then. Whether in the kitchen or on the balcony or curled up on the couch, Jimin would always find him. He wouldn't say anything right away. He'd just stand beside him or brush hair from Jungkook's eyes or rest his head on his shoulder. And Jungkook would breathe again. One morning, after a long night in the studio, they found themselves sitting at the Han River again, legs swinging over the edge of the cement. Taehyung had gone home early, needing rest before a photo shoot. Jimin and Jungkook were alone, wrapped in hoodies and quiet. "I used to come here when I wanted to disappear," Jungkook said. Jimin turned to him, startled by the honesty in the statement. "I never wanted to die," Jungkook clarified. "But I wanted to be invisible, just for a little while, to stop being watched, to stop feeling like everything I did was a performance." "I know the feeling," Jimin said. "I lived in it." Jungkook looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought you were too far away," Jimin answered. "You were beside me every day, but I couldn't reach you, and then I got tired of trying. I hate that I let it get that far." Jimin smiled, sad and sweet. "But you came back, and this time you stayed." "I will always stay now," Jungkook said, and it wasn't a promise. It was a fact. They sat in silence again, but it was the kind that healed, the kind that mended things gently. A bird flew low over the river, its reflection trailing it in the water like a shadow of flight. Jungkook watched it go, then leaned his head against Jimin's shoulder. Jimin didn't move for a long time. Then he tilted his head, pressing his cheek lightly to the crown of Jungkook's hair. They didn't need fireworks. They didn't need dramatic declarations. They had this. The quiet choosing. The daily return. And that, more than anything, was what love had become for them. Not a storm, but an anchor. Later that night, Jimin wrote a letter he never planned to post. It wasn't for the fans. It wasn't for the press. It was for himself. He wrote about forgiveness, about resilience, about Jungkook's eyes when he cries and how they always find his in a crowd. He wrote about Taehyung's silences and how they speak louder than most people's words. He wrote about fear and how it still lives in his chest sometimes. But now, when it does, he doesn't hide from it. He reaches out. And someone is there. The letter ended with a sentence that felt like the most honest thing he'd ever written. "Even if we break again, I'll still come back, because some bonds don't shatter, they just bend, and when they're held with love, they always return to shape." Jungkook never read that letter. But somehow he lived it. And so did Taehyung. And so did every song they sang after that. Because now, their voices didn't just harmonize. They healed. The scent of late autumn lingered in the breeze, faint traces of fallen leaves mixing with the warmth of cinnamon from street vendors preparing for the seasonal crowds. Seoul was entering its in-between season, no longer basked in summer's glow, not yet blanketed in winter's hush. It was a fragile time, a time for transition. And in that fragile time, something between them began to bloom more quietly, more steadily than anything that had come before. Jungkook had started staying over more often, not because they discussed it, not because they planned to, but because his feet took him there when the night ended, as if his body remembered the way even when his mind was tired. Jimin never asked for explanations. He simply left the hallway light on, the key on the table, an extra toothbrush in the cup by the sink. All the small gestures that whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." They lived around each other like the tide lives around the shore, coming in, receding, coming back again. Jungkook found comfort in Jimin's quiet routines. The way he would sit cross-legged with a book, glasses sliding down his nose, unaware of how he looked. The way he tapped his pen against the counter when he was thinking. How he always folded Jungkook's hoodie the same way, even if he was mad. And Jimin, he rediscovered things he thought he'd forgotten. Like the way Jungkook sang when he cooked, humming under his breath, letting the music fill up the corners of the room. The way he paced when he was trying to apologize but didn't know how to start. How his hand always found the side of Jimin's neck when they hugged, fingers curling instinctively at the pulse. But healing wasn't linear, and not every day was soft. There were moments when the air still turned sharp, when old wounds reopened without warning. One evening, Jungkook had gotten home late. He hadn't messaged. The studio had run long. Jimin sat at the kitchen table, eyes on the untouched food, the candles burned down to puddles. His chest was tight, and it wasn't about the food or the weight. It was about every time he had waited in silence before, thinking maybe this time was the last time he'd be forgotten. When Jungkook walked in, hair tousled, cheeks pink from the cold, he saw the tension immediately. The look in Jimin's eyes wasn't anger, it was absence. "I'm sorry," Jungkook said. "I didn't mean to lose track." Jimin stood, chair scraping softly against the floor. "It's not about the time." "I know." "Do you?" Jungkook stepped forward. "Yes, because I felt it too. Every time I didn't show up before, I felt it the second I saw your face." Jimin swallowed hard, jaw tight. "Sometimes I'm still scared, that one day you'll go quiet again, that I'll be the only one standing there still hopping." "I'm not going anywhere," Jungkook said. "You've said that before." "I know," he whispered, "but this time I'm living it." It wasn't a fix-all, but Jungkook walked over, wrapped his arms around him, and held on until the silence softened. And that night, they didn't sleep in separate rooms like they once had. They held onto each other with arms and legs tangled. Breath shared in a space, so small yet wide enough to carry their fears. Elsewhere, Taehyung was navigating his own shadows. Though he stood beside them through every step, though his laughter lit up the coldest rooms, there were moments when even he felt the ghost of being in between. The third. The one who had watched, who had caught both when they fell, but who didn't always know how to ask for the same in return. One afternoon, while the three of them were back in the studio going over demo revisions, Taehyung had been uncharacteristically silent. The kind of quiet that made the room feel off balance. He didn't argue over vocal takes. He didn't joke when the melody skipped. Jungkook noticed first. "You okay?" Taehyung looked up from the mixing board, eyes dark beneath the brim of his beanie. "Yeah," he said, but it was too fast, too smooth. Jimin set his pencil down. Taehyung sighed, then leaned back in his chair, the sound of his exhale heavy. "Do you ever feel like the thing you're holding together is heavier than you thought? Like maybe you kept patching holes for so long that now you don't know where your own voice starts?" Jungkook looked at him carefully. "You were the only reason we even had a chance to make it here." I know, Taehyung said, but I don't always want to be the glue. Sometimes I want to be the thing someone else holds. The room fell quiet. Jimin reached across the table, fingers brushing Taehyung's hand. You are. We just forgot how to show it. No, Jungkook said, voice low. We didn't forget. We just took for granted that you'd always be strong enough to not need reminding. I'm tired, Taehyung admitted. I want to lean on someone without it cracking open everything. You can lean on me, Jimin said. And me, Jungkook added. That night they didn't work on music. They went back to Jungkook's place, ordered too much food, drank wine they barely touched, and ended up on the floor, piled like they used to be during their trainee days. Laughter came eventually, not from forgetting the sadness but from making space beside it. Some nights they'd talk until 3 a.m., about old memories, about the future, about what it meant to still be here after all the versions of themselves had been peeled away in front of the world. And some nights they said nothing at all, just breathed in each other's nearness and knew that was enough. When the documentary team approached them about filming the next comeback process, they hesitated. The thought of cameras again, of reliving every crack and scrape in high definition, was terrifying. But eventually they said yes. Because they didn't want to erase the story. They wanted to tell it properly this time. So the world could see not just the final act, but the moments that shaped it, the ugly parts, the healing, the unspoken love that had always threaded between them like invisible wire. The footage showed everything. The silent glances across studio tables, the arguments, the night Jimin left in the middle of a take and didn't come back for hours, the time Taehyung sat alone on a rooftop talking to the stars, the way Jungkook chased after him later, hands trembling, whispering apologies against his back. It showed the joy too. Their first finished track, the moment Jimin cried while recording his verse and Jungkook took his hand through the booth glass, the way Taehyung laughed during dance practice until he fell over, clutching his ribs, tears streaming down his cheeks. Fans didn't expect it to be perfect. They just wanted it to be real. And when the first episode aired, the internet flooded not with scandal, but with gratitude. Messages poured in. From people who'd fallen apart and were trying to put themselves back together. From friends who had stopped speaking and didn't know how to say I miss you. From strangers who finally saw themselves in the vulnerability of 3 boys learning how to love again, not just each other, but themselves. And that was the quiet triumph they hadn't even realized they needed. They didn't have to be symbols anymore. They were human. And that was enough. The first snowfall arrived on a morning none of them were expecting. It wasn't heavy. It didn't blanket the city in white the way it sometimes did in midwinter. But it was enough to dust the rooftops and make the breath catch in Jungkook's throat as he stood by the kitchen window. He hadn't said a word yet that morning. He hadn't needed to. Jimin was still asleep on the couch, tangled in a blanket too small for his frame, face half buried in a pillow Jungkook had shoved under his head sometime after midnight. They stayed up too late again, not talking, just existing beside each other in the softest form of togetherness. Jungkook reached for his phone to take a photo, not of the snow, but of Jimin. The way the light hit his cheekbone, the way the corners of his mouth curled slightly, as if even in sleep, something inside him had learned how to rest again. He didn't post the photo. He just stared at it, fingers hovering over the screen, and saved it for himself. He turned the kettle on. The gentle whistle became a familiar rhythm in the quiet space. Outside, the city moved with slower steps, people tugging jackets tighter, children stomping joyfully through shallow patches of white, lovers walking closer beneath shared umbrellas. Inside, it felt like the world had paused just enough to let healing become real. Jimin stirred when the scent of tea filled the air. He blinked sleepily, body stiff as he sat up. Jungkook placed a cup beside him on the coffee table and sat on the floor, crossing his legs. Their eyes met, and Jimin offered a silent smile, the kind that needed no language. "The snow's here," Jungkook said softly. Jimin looked toward the window. "I used to hate the first snow." "Why?" "Because it always reminded me of time passing, of everything I hadn't said, every apology I never gave." Jungkook tilted his head. "And now?" Jimin leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "Now it feels like proof that the world still turns, that we survived long enough to see it again." The words sank deep into Jungkook's chest. He reached over and took Jimin's hand, fingers cool against his. "I'm glad I get to see it with you." They drank tea in silence. Then they layered up and went outside. No makeup, no stylists, no managers. Just them in oversized coats and matching scarves Taehyung had given them last Christmas, walking the quiet streets like ghosts finally made flesh. The air was crisp, each breath visible in front of them. They didn't talk much, but when they reached the footbridge near the river, Jimin slowed to a stop. Jungkook followed, watching as he stared down at the frozen water, eyes distant. "Sometimes," Jimin began, "I still get scared that this isn't real, that I'll wake up and we'll be strangers again." Jungkook stepped beside him. "If it was a dream, I would have begged not to wake up already." Jimin's breath hitched. "And if it ever feels like we're drifting again," Jungkook continued, voice low and firm, "we fight for it. Not run, not fall silent, we fight." Jimin turned to face him. The weight in his eyes wasn't fear anymore. It was gratitude so profound it trembled. "Promise me," he whispered. "I already did." That night they returned to the studio, not to work but to play. Taehyung was already there, seated at the piano, his fingers drifting lazily across the keys in a melody too sad for the smile on his face. He didn't turn when they entered. He just kept playing. Jimin leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "That's new." Taehyung glanced at him. "It's nothing, just something I started when I couldn't sleep." "It sounds like everything." Jungkook stepped closer. "Play it again." So he did. And this time, Jungkook began to hum. Then Jimin joined. They weren't recording, they weren't writing. They were remembering.